please vote. Okay, we have a short agenda, but hopefully it won't be too long. But up first, communication from the public. Is there anybody from the public that wishes to address the council on something not on the agenda? All right. Seeing nobody rush the microphone, we'll move on to item number 1, placing city-sponsored and citizen-sponsored cannabis measure on the ballot. City Manager Parker.
City Attorney has prepared what amounts to two ordinances in addition to the initiative proposed by the public.
Correct. So this evening there are 3 separate resolutions and 3 separate initiatives in your packet. The first is the initiative that was through a citizen petition that's qualified for the ballot, and pursuant to the Elections Code, you need to vote to place that on the ballot for the November 6th election this year. And the other 2 are 2 different alternatives for a city-sponsored initiative measure. The first, we refer to it for sort of the ease of reference in the staff report as the tax and regulate measure. And that's the one that was in your last packet from the last meeting. It establishes a 1-year period after the election, if it's passed, for the City Council to adopt an ordinance permitting cannabis businesses in the city consistent with the criteria that are laid out in that initiative. It's aimed and drafted to provide the maximum flexibility to the council in establishing that regulatory program. However, it does set certain parameters that are primarily based on the information we gleaned from the FM3 survey. That was, you saw the survey results in the July 10th meeting, I believe. The second alternative is a tax-only measure. Now, the tax provision in the tax and regulate and the tax provision in the tax only are identical. So what they provide for are 15% tax on the gross revenues of dispensaries and any other cannabis businesses other than those specifically listed in the ordinance. So that would be like testing laboratories and distributors primarily. There's also a 25% gross receipts tax on manufacturing. And for cultivators, it would be $30 per square foot of cultivation space. So those tax provisions are identical in both options. The first option, the tax and regulate, puts a provision in place that would require the council to take action within a year to allow, subject to a license and conditional use permit, cannabis businesses. The tax-only measure actually includes a prohibition on cannabis businesses that will stay in place until December 31st, 2020. At such time, that voter-approved prohibition will lift, and the council will have its authority that it has today, which is to either prohibit or allow, subject to regulations, the full scope of local regulatory control. So I don't have a PowerPoint or anything. I know Alan and his staff have prepared maps to kind of show you the impacts of the citizen measure, and I'll let him discuss those maps with you. But
you want to go ahead? Sure.
Chris, you want to handle the mic?
Oh, yeah.
It was.
So you actually have them in your email inbox. So if you've got your laptops and can pull up your computers, you have them in your inbox. So what we have here, 4 maps. We've got one citywide, qualified. Okay. We've got one map is the Qualified Cannabis Initiative. And this is this one right here. And it's the entire city based on where the zoning permitted uses are in the city of Hemet. And so you'll see the parcels in purple are the areas in which the city qualified cannabis initiative is permitted per the initiative that's qualified for the ballot. And so these two other maps, qualified cannabis initiative, both of these are blow-up areas of the larger city area. And so what you can see, one of them is kind of around the airport area. Again, the purple parcels are the ones that would permit cannabis operations based on the qualified cannabis initiative. Again, this portion right here that you've got is in the upper north east portion of the city. So those are just exploded, blown up areas of the larger map that you have in front of you. Now the middle map,
And the orange?
the orange are sports and schools, which are state regulations in terms of the distance between allowable cannabis operations. And so we've created the buffer zone so that you can see that the areas in yellow obviously cannot have cannabis operations. I think it's 500 or 600 feet.
In the state regulations, there are setbacks of 600 feet from certain uses. And then in the citizen initiative itself, it also includes a separation requirement between cannabis businesses of 1,000 feet. So these contiguous parcels might not necessarily all be developed with cannabis businesses.
Correct. And then the final map that we have here is based on if the council chose to put its own city initiative on the ballot, based on the zoning that...
Can you put that, excuse me, Chris, but can you put it on top of that chair there?
Sure.
Right here?
Yeah. Okay.
Is that better?
All right, yeah, that's better.
Okay, and so the last map that we have is based on the proposed initiative before you. These are the permitted zoning uses and the potential locations where you would have it.
Put it over there.
Sure.
Honestly, I can't see all that.
But I will
Thank you.
say that based on the ordinance as it is, the council could at a later date limit the amount of, or limit additional uses, additional locations per ordinance in the future. That just is the basis of where it could potentially end up based on how it's written in the Hemet proposed initiative.
So the red area is dispensaries?
So the red area is C1, C2, and then the other areas are based, C1, commercial manufacturing, business park, limited manufacturing, and then heavy manufacturing. And then based on what is in the city proposed initiative, those uses would be allowed in those areas.
And just to clarify, I know you said this already, so the way the tax and regulate measure is written is that, so if it's approved, what's it doing is essentially saying there is a voter-approved prohibition on any cannabis businesses in residential zones and any zone where a manufacturing use is not allowed. But the city council expressly reserves the ability to further refine the zones where the businesses are allowed. So that's sort of the maximum area that you would be allowed to permit cannabis businesses based on the tax and regulate measure, but the measure allows you to further limit the area. So you don't have to allow all of that. That's the maximum possibility.
If I might add, the invisible map that's not here carries forth the ban, but does put in place a voter-approved tax. And the thought behind there is that is what's mandatory. The voters have to approve any tax, but there were a couple of reasons we presented that to you last time, is that we don't think the city can afford to gear up to deal with the cannabis issue, the enforcement issue, et cetera. In the first 2 years, it may cost as much as $1 million to gear up for that. And then the second thing is we simply don't have the staff to administer this. And so we thought we could get a buy-off, go ahead and put the tax into place, and then in the next year or two, we'd figure out how to pay for it, what you want to put into place, et cetera, and then you could do it at the end of a 2-year period. So it was kind of a fail-safe kind of thing that I know that there's been questions back and forth and some concern about what's been the effect in other cities over time. It hasn't been all glory, although the Coachella Valley seems to be having a ball doing this and earning money. But Paris has backed off, and we don't see anything happening in our city next door. Riverside County has put a hold on it, the city of Riverside. And so the thought being is most of the cities in California are being cautious. And then perhaps if you wanted to be cautious, we thought we ought to still deal with the tax issue, and the tax issue would be a way of confronting the ordinance on there because it's lower taxes and the council is precluded from raising taxes in the first couple of years. So we tried to attack both aspects of it.
Questions for staff? Comments? Lonnie, you got a lot of tabs on you.
I do have a lot of tabs. This is, so people know, we did look at our stuff. We often get accused of not looking at our things, so.
But if I may, before we jump into questions, I just want to point out for the record that after the packet was published, we realized that there were some typographical errors and things, and so we've fixed all of those and have revised versions here. And as a part of that, I've also made some tweaks to the actual ballot questions that are in the resolutions. They're substantively the same as what's in your packet, but I made some tweaks to the language to ensure compliance with various election code provisions. Okay.
Can I ask one question on the, how is it on here? The citizen proposed initiative, do we have any choice about voting yes on it?
Voting yes to place it on the ballot.
I mean, we can say no, but they can still do it, right? It's still qualified.
Well, legally,
Makes no
it's a
difference.
ministerial duty. You don't have an option. They have a constitutional right to place initiatives on the ballot.
Okay, that's what I figured. Do we have a map designating where they want to put all of their grow houses?
That was the one, the first one, that it was all
North of
presented, the
Oakland.
purple. Oops, where'd it go?
Well, you took one way too soon. We're still discussing it.
Chris, you have to understand we're older than you are.
Yeah.
Initiative one.
Yes.
The Citizens Initiative.
You want the blow up of a specific area?
Yes, please.
Which one?
Citizens Initiative with the grow, I believe it was north of Oakland, was it not? Okay,
Can you,
sure.
Oakland is down here.
Show, okay, that's, okay. And where is State Street?
All right.
That's right through the middle.
and so what's at the top there? What's the street going across at the top? Up, the next,
By the orange,
yeah.
if that's Esplanade, because that's the, boundary line between there and San Jacinto.
And is the orange there, I forgot what you said, the orange there is where,
Sports complex, that's
That's a
Valley Line.
Valley Wide
Valley Wide.
Sports Complex.
not good to have one right across the street.
And so you'll see the red is the actual buffer.
Right, so the purple that is inside that red
Right.
bubble, you would not be able to have cannabis businesses in there. But outside of the red line, it would be.
And the same goes for, if you go straight down the middle, there's another red circle down there. What is that green? Is that Sunnydale?
Daycare center.
Daycare center, okay. Okay,
Yellow.
Yellow is a school.
okay.
And, sorry, but could you tell me what the street is on the right there, up, at the top of the second group? Come down, yeah, there. What's that street there going across?
This is Buena Vista right here.
Okay, and then across,
So Oakwood,
Oakland?
Oakwood,
Oakland.
yeah, Oakwood Street.
Okay, and then on the side there.
This one?
No, the other side.
Santa Fe.
Santa
Avenue.
Fe.
Well, where's this, and the school that's on Santa Fe? Is the one down there,
Down there, yeah.
that far away from Oakland? Demonstrator to Oakland? I'm sure so. A new way of going home.
Okay.
Oh, gosh.
And do we know those current locations are, is that fairground? I mean, is that dirt or is that buildings? Or is it just zoned?
Know if that's vacant land or if it's brick.
I don't know.
I'm thinking most of it is privately owned, or at least a lot of it, especially along Santa Fe. It's where that housing project is going to go in. Okay.
Erica, on the map that we're looking at there, the M1 area that's to the east, the farthest east, that goes along Santa Fe, just to the south of that is a residential area, I believe. So if it's zone M1 and they could have it grow, but they also have to be a certain distance away from residential areas, right?
I don't believe so. Off the top of my head, the setbacks in the state requirements are from schools, parks, daycare centers, youth centers.
Okay, so there's no separation requirement for residential areas.
Not under the citizen initiative. Some cities, when they adopt their own regulations, impose residential setback requirements.
Because just philosophically, it seems, that when you have an M1 area right up against a residential area, then that might be something that if we were going to be taking any action, that we might want to consider those buffer zones so that they're not right up against residential areas. Primarily for the same reasons that you have separation from recreational areas and schools, because there's kids in the neighborhoods there.
The M1, M2 zones that are right there are, it's vacant land. However, there is a sports park that's not marked on there, which is just to the east of that M2, that little M2 block.
Yeah, Searle,
It's right at
Searle
the
Park
end of
up on
that
just north
residential.
of Menlo on Santa Fe,
Yeah.
or Buena Vista. Buena Vista,
Top of Buena Vista.
top of Buena Vista, yeah,
Very end of Buena Vista.
okay.
It's right next to that. There's
Yeah,
housing
right in here.
development right there.
Yes.
And residential. Okay.
Well, I'm not sure what happened with our ordinance.
I do too. I like the tax in 2 years.
Me too.
and December 2020. I mean, if, to do something like that, I mean, we've got to have time to put together a structure that will be acceptable to the citizens and beneficial to the city and workable for staff. I mean, I am not prepared to lose staff over a cannabis issue. I really am not. And if we burden them with everything really quickly, we're going to lose a lot of people.
It would also seem that at whatever time, whether it's now or a year or whatever, that you're going to start to promulgate uses.
Absolutely.
You need to have meetings in the community and such that would be affected.
And I think for more and more people that it's the end use of the creams and the oils and the CBD portion and not the recreational pot, so to speak. But it is the dispensary, the medicinal things that people are looking for to use. The product, yeah.
Well, I think another advantage of that would not only give us time to do our work that we need to do here locally, but there'll be more information forthcoming from other jurisdictions, from the state, from the federal, about this whole issue of the conflict in federal law and state law. And because I don't think we've heard anywhere close to the end of that discussion, and I think there's going to be a lot of case law coming down. So who knows what the landscape will be in a legal perspective a year from now, 2 years from now.
Then, feds could approve it.
Yeah.
So,
To me, it just makes sense that we give ourselves appropriate amount of time and look at all the aspects and the impacts on staff and the enforceability and the practicality of what we would be trying to regulate.
My take is that I'm still opposed to it. That's my personal feeling. There is that conflict still between state and federal law. And my concern is that, is there potential liability to the city if we move forward and allow this illegal activity under federal law? Is there going to be any liability to the city at some point? Could there be? I mean, there could be a change in direction at the federal level, and
There's always
That's
just
my
the
concern.
potential. It's hard to say because it's still an evolving area, and thus far the federal government hasn't really cracked down in California like some people thought would happen. But it is an unknown. However, the less you're sort of actively involved in the cannabis activity, the less liability there would be. So if you're comparing just these two proposed city measures, a measure that just imposes a tax that still prohibits the business is sort of a one step less than the tax and regulate. Though I do think that the liability on either one is probably fairly slim under the current facts. It's just you never know how the facts may change going forward.
then I do have one more concern, is that we don't have the manning to be able to regulate any of this, to be able to provide customer service to this industry.
or protection.
Right? And so it's going to take money to hire the people to be able to do it, to process applications, to do the enforcement on the inside, and so I don't think we're there yet, personally. So, I mean, I'm leaning toward, if we're going to do anything, I'm leaning toward the tax and let's hold off, as opposed to as a competing, or just, part of me just wants to say, let this one go through and we'll continue our moratorium or and our prohibition and see where this one goes. But the problem is that if that passes, we still don't have the personnel to be able to process the mandates that are in that.
Definitely a catch-22.
On your liability question, there was a federal crackdown of an Indian reservation in the north that chose to grow, and the feds came in and closed it down. An Indian reservation, and also a local sheriff closed down another Indian reservation, and somehow.
Yeah, Indian reservations present unique issues because technically that's federally owned land. It's owned by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Yeah, which is why, in my experience working with Cathedral City, we work closely with the Agua Caliente tribe, which has its reservation in Cathedral City and Palm Springs, and they're very much have ordinances on books prohibiting all cannabis businesses on any Indian land, and we work closely with them to make sure that doesn't happen.
I think I share the same confliction that the mayor has on the legal aspects of it. And I know that the state law passed, and looking at how the voters in Hemet voted, the majority were supportive of Prop 64, but only by a slim margin. So it was pretty close to 51-49 or 52-48, basically, of all the, and again, that's just a representation of registered voters who actually voted.
Right.
So it's not necessarily indicative of the entire population. We did the survey, and the survey kind of matched up with what the vote was on 64. So I think we have a sense of where our community is on the issue, but I still have the similar concerns about the confliction of the law and even if it's remote, potential liability if we get overly involved in it. But the other side of it is that when we look at the citizen initiative, if we don't put anything up against that for voters to compare and contrast, and it gets passed, then that becomes what we have to deal with, and so we still have the regulatory thing falls in our lap anyhow. And part of what gives rise to concern is that in looking at the two, a comparison of what city option A is and what the citizen initiative is, there's a substantial dearth of self-regulation. Minimal security, no background checks on employees, and that's disconcerting to me. That I know that they made a good case at our last meeting about that this is really a citizen-driven thing. It's not an outsider thing, and we really want to do this right. But that conflicts with what's in their initiative, because there's not a demonstrated concern about, we're going to do background checks, and we're going to have tight security, and we're going to self-regulate. There's not a whole lot of that in there. So again, if that measure were to pass, it falls in our lap to have to deal with all of those, for lack of a better term, inadequacies that I see.
Citizen-driven is one thing. However, we as policymakers need to do our due diligence to protect and serve the will of the people responsibly. And that responsibility includes making sure that we take everything into consideration and address it or approach it in a responsible manner. And that is making sure that, again, staff, the city has enough staff to do that. And importantly, that, whether you're against it or you're in support of it, that approach is number one as far as making sure that we protect everyone, the citizens, the city, all those involved, and that we all know takes time. So I
I think due to the fact that this is such a controversial item, more so, well, some people think it's already a done deal, but I guess it would help if down the road, within that 2 years, we had the federal approval, make it a little bit easier. But in any event, we still have to be cognizant of how to protect, how to serve, and how to do everything responsibly for our residents. So,
Well, and with that, it's protection. Ultimately, we set policy that's going to be favorable toward the financial well-being of the city.
exactly.
And if we don't do that, then we're failing on our part. And I think that we need to make sure. So I don't want to be mistaken that personally I disagree with the use of marijuana. However, that we need to look at this from a financial standpoint is what's it going to cost the city if one passes or the other one passes? Does the city have the resources? Because it's going to take a lot of resources on the city's part should this initiative pass. And we're going to be on the hook for it. All the taxpayers are going to be on the hook for it, including the taxpayers that don't agree with marijuana. So their tax dollars are going to be used for something they disagree with.
And I guess the argument can be, well,
And
the revenue coming in would pay for that, but that's way
down the road. So it's got to be front-loaded with being able to fund it, to be able to get the people in so that can process the paperwork, do the background checks, and do all the logistics side of it, as opposed to, hey, let's just open it up. I mean, there's still staff involved, and there's time involved, and it's going to cost the city a considerable amount of money that we don't have in the budget at the moment.
And then Linda had, from the get-go, from the beginning, had talked about generating enough revenue for pay for the enforcement of the illegal, the black market. And so, notwithstanding what Hija came up with, we don't know whether we even generate enough to deal with the black market or make money off it or anything like that. And so I think we need more examples of other cities, perhaps our size and scope, the kind of revenue that they accrue over the next year and such, and how much goes out, to deal with black market issues and such.
Well, I think with so many of the other cities holding off, that just tells you that there's some things to think about before moving forward. Otherwise, they wouldn't be pulling back and waiting. So,
But it's that there's so many issues that are coming up day by day, and one of them is just the odor that is associated with growing. And I know Cathedral City is having issues with that. Desert Hot Springs is having issues, and basically having to come up with guidelines on the fly, so to speak, just to deal because the citizens are up in arms about, this may be a revenue stream for the city, but what does it do to our quality of life? And I think we absolutely need to be very, very careful about how we go forward on something like this and take all these unintended consequences and extenuating circumstances into account before we go anywhere. But at the same time, we've got to do it what's best for the city and what's best for our citizens.
Being surrounded by the mountains and not really that airflow going through, we're going to get stuck. And those people that are near the groves, I'm sure ultimately there'll be equipment that, just like they do in casinos, that takes everything out or just dissipates everything. But
Cathedral City, if you'd like, I can talk a little bit about the odor issue. Cathedral City did experience problems with odor. They've made a lot of progress on containing it, but you're right, it was a problem, and they had to sort of, learn as they go. From what I understand, the biggest issue is with the cultivation moving into existing buildings, because it's not new construction. Things are drafty, things need to be resealed, and it's really hard to sort of troubleshoot where the odor is coming from. There are things like negative air pressure, which the city now requires all cultivation to sort of stem that flow of the scent coming out of the cultivation businesses. But in areas like Cathedral City, where they've really concentrated a lot of their cultivation and manufacturing businesses into their one sort of major industrial area. If you're standing outside and you've got 5 or so different cultivation and businesses around you, it can be very difficult to tell which business it's coming from. But they definitely learned from that, and it's something that if you were to allow cultivation or any other cannabis businesses in 2 years, if you go this tax-only route, that's all information that you can have and learn from the cities that have gone before you.
Right. I was talking about this issue at a Chamber of Commerce Governmental Affairs meeting the day after we had our last meeting, and representatives from Eastern Municipal Water District and from Southern California Edison were there, and they both encouraged restraint and to really flesh out where establishments would be put because of the water usage and the drain on power. And one of the issues that were brought up was Desert Hot Springs, in where some of their grows are located. The infrastructure for electricity and water is not there. And they said it's going to be like 5 years before those agencies are able to put in the infrastructure that is going to support those type of businesses. So every time you turn around, somebody is saying, did you think of this? And oh, by the way, did you think of this? And these things are all, having to be taken into consideration. And it's not like growing 2 tomato plants in your backyard. I mean, there's a
Mine die there, so.
And on the positive side, we did vote to move forward on the CCA for the city, so.
Yes.
That could,
And solar farms, I guess, would be very, very, very good. So who knows? Yeah, we can invest in solar power too.
there's a big roof right over here.
And a big field out on Sanderson. Yeah.
So just to make sure that I'm reading this clearly, I guess I'm sensing that there's a leaning to the tax only, and if we voted to approve the tax only, it goes on the ballot. The citizen initiative goes on the ballot, and whichever option gets the most votes is what's adopted, correct?
Correct. So the citizen measure includes a provision that says it conflicts with any other measure on the ballot that taxes and regulates cannabis. We've included a similar provision in both of the proposed city measures as well. So with those clauses in place and under state law, if they were to both get majority approval, the one with the highest number of yes votes is the one that would control.
Yeah, that was what my interpretation was from reading both measures, all 3 measures, and the staff report. So, from the city's perspective, am I correct in assuming that probably the one that gives us the most leeway and time to sit and watch what happens on all of these issues and develop some plans to address it would be the tax only? That's essentially the staff recommendation.
Are there any more comments? Okay. So this is a discussion item. Sarah, you had some speakers. So I will open the public hearing on this.
I have one. Ricky Jones wants to speak.
Ricky, come on up. How are you, sir?
Good, sir. How are you?
Doing well.
I wanted to, first of all, thank you for
Can you put your mic on? There you go.
I wanted to thank you for letting me speak tonight, and thank you for the great job you're doing in the city of Hemet. I live in San Jacinto, but I will be moving to Hemet in December, and that's why I wanted to come and speak tonight.
Could you speak a little bit more to the mic? You can move over. Thank you.
All right, sorry about that. 5 years ago, I brought GB Sciences to the city of San Jacinto. My background is I'm a retired Los Angeles County Deputy Sheriff. I'm a U.S. government counterterrorist specialist for 10 years, and I worked with TSA to help set it up with Admiral Loy. I've been retired. I've buried 2 wives to breast cancer, and cannabis has been in my life since 1985 because of my first wife, Rosie. She was dying. She had terminal breast cancer. She was dying because she was starving as well, and the pain was horrific. There was a company that came out and said, hey, the medicine's not working, try this. And it was something as simple as boiling marijuana and having her drinking tea. My wife lived for 2 more years because she was able to hold nutrition down until the cancer just engulfed her body. And my daughter got to see her mom for 2 more years. My second wife had cancer throughout her whole body. A horrible incident. Morphine wasn't working. Cannabis took the pain away. She had all her full senses, and she died in peace. I'm not an advocate for just people smoking dope. I'm just not. I buried police officer brothers and sisters in law enforcement over a joint back in the 80s when I was active. I'm for the medical. I've read a lot of initiatives, and I've spoken around the country. I've spoken for the medical part. And a couple questions I wanted to address tonight that you brought up. The security is regulated by the state. Everybody has to go through a secret background check, just like an employee at TSA. That's mandatory standard. And that's not on the city to do that. They can come here and pay the police department to have their live scan done, and that goes to the FBI and DOJ for clearance. But that's not on the city. It's on the companies that hire. As far as the smell, I've been around a long time, and Cathedral City did this. A lot of the buildings that exist where they made the mistake is they're old buildings. They didn't have the system to filter the air. So what this initiative, all these, and again, I've read hundreds of initiatives, what they're doing, what you do when you build them, you build a building inside the building. And you have a circulation system that purifies air. It doesn't go into the public. Am I supposed to walk away now?
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So the smell won't be an issue in the city here, just like it's not in Nevada. They've adapted what GB Sciences has done, and other buildings in Cathedral City has done as well. The reason I like the initiative, the Citizens Initiative, 2 things. Within the first year, it will raise $2 million for the city. And as an operations officer for the government, I understand the burden on law enforcement. And God bless you. Nowadays, I don't know how you guys do it. And I truly mean God bless you all. The money raised on this initiative goes toward law enforcement and homelessness and charity, things like that, from what I read. It will help the city with the burden that they're facing with crime, with dispensaries and things like that. And I'm not telling anybody how to run their department, but within a year it gives you the ability to get a task force, to work with the DA, to work with the federal agencies and come in and shut them down. And have enough police officers on the street to do that, qualified police officers. It's a heavy burden what you have and the decisions you have to make, because you represent every soul in this city. It's a very hard task. The one thing I do like about the Citizens Initiative, it's very simple. It's very simple. They have to follow the state rules. The FDA just approved the first cannabis drug to be sold over the counter and through pharmacies. The veterans who need it will be able to have it. GB Sciences, who I've known for many years, has been notified by the FDA. Their Alzheimer's, their Parkinson's, and their arthritis formula are in their studies now to be approved for them to go into trial. they're going to expedite the trial because it saves lives, what they've developed. I know these men. I've met James. I've sought them out. They've sought me out to talk about this. And I'm not paid. I'm not anything other than I've read it. And in my opinion, I've dealing this for many, many years and I know what the government's doing. They have an opiate panel now of congressmen, Democrats and Republicans. They're coming together and they're going to submit a report to the president. More people are dying from the opiates, addiction, more crime because of that. In all the years in law enforcement, I never had anybody overdose on marijuana. Never saw it in my life. As a chaplain to the Marines and law enforcement, I'm going to funerals of these kids dying weekly. It's horrifying. So if there's alternatives for the medicine, and these gentlemen, they're going to grow for medicine. I'm hoping they contract with GB Sciences, to create, because once they're approved, they're going to need high quality, certified stuff for medicine. And it's a good marriage. I can't speak for the city because I don't live here yet. I think the citizen proposal, if studied, I think talking with Cathedral City Council is a professional courtesy because this is pretty much the same program they have there. And it's worth just researching. And I truly ask that you check with the FDA to see that they did approve the first cannabis medicine 5 weeks ago, that GB Sciences and 2 other companies are getting ready for approval to go into the trials. You can call them and they'll tell you. I recommend going to tours in Nevada, which, James and some of these other people that want to do this have gone there toured to get the best information possible to grow. I mean, no signs on the buildings, no pot smell going outside. No one knows they're there. They just don't know. The security will be top-notch because it's required by law. So, I'm just a guy who knows what it can do for people in need. I don't agree with dispensaries one bit. In a city like this, we have so many illegal dispensaries here in the valley, it's heartbreaking. And they need to be shut down. And one way to do that is to get the funds to build a section of the police department working with the DA to go and arrest everybody and shut them down and destroy their product. Because none of it's regulated. None of it has a testing facility that's required for these gentlemen if they get the initiative passed that's tested. And there's a couple companies like DigiPath that are ISO certified. One of the few in the nation that wants to come to the valley here to be a testing. So that's what I have to say. I know it's a heavy burden, but I really pray that you'll do the research. I have an advantage because I've been having to deal with this for many years. And now, yeah, thank you, ma'am. And if you want, call GB Sciences, talk to Andrea Small-Howard. She is the foremost scientist in America. She was just invited last month, and you can go on their website, to speak at the Alzheimer and Parkinson's National Symposium in Washington, D.C. She's the one that created the medicine that stops Parkinson's patients from shaking completely. They don't shake. It doesn't cure the disease, but it stops one of the symptoms.
Thank you, sir. Is there anybody else that wanted to speak on this topic? All right, seeing none, I will close the public hearing, bring it back to the council. Any other comments, questions, concerns?
Look.
So we've got 2 resolutions.
If the citizens, if the residents here choose to support the citizens' measure, then they do. And then we have to deal with whatever we have to deal with. I don't think any of us wouldn't like the revenue that it could generate. And I would be totally against the dispensaries, and to the extent of just really allowing grow reasonably and responsibly at a later date. But again, you know, if the voters vote for it, then we deal with what we have to deal with.
Okay, so we've got a couple options. I can take these out of order. The first one, we need a motion to adopt 1B, and that's the citizens, placing that on the ballot. I don't think there's much of a...
It's not on the ballot yet. You need to adopt a resolution placing it on the ballot, which is the first one in your packet.
So,
If you say no, it goes on the ballot anyway.
If you say no, it doesn't go on the ballot automatically, but you'll likely get sued to place it on the ballot, and the court will order you to do it. And you'll pay attorney's fees. You'll pay attorney's fees. And not only the cities, but most likely also the proponent's attorney's fees. So it's just a costlier way to get it on the ballot.
So we can vote yes with our fingers crossed.
Fine with me.
so is there a motion for 1B? Reluctantly?
You want to make the motion?
Okay, fine. So I'll move that we adopt Resolution Bill 18068, placing the citizens measure on the November 6th ballot, November 6th, 2018 ballot. I so move. Is there a second?
And I'll second that.
Please vote
I
on
am
that.
under duress.
Okay. So that passes 3-1 for putting it on the ballot. Now we have some other options. We've got consider the 2 drafts city-sponsored, or, ultimately there's a third option, which is we don't do anything and we continue
Sure.
the prohibition and we just see how this plays out, or the city staff has put together these 2 ordinances, so I'll let somebody else do what you want on this one.
Then I would make a motion to approve Resolution Bill number 18-070, which is establishing a tax on cannabis businesses and a voter-approved prohibition on cannabis businesses through December 31, 2020.
Please vote. Okay, so that passes 4-0 to place the competing tax on the ballot. Does anybody want to make a motion for this third or the second option for tax and regulate? Seeing none, that one dies. Okay.
We're okay. We don't have to say no.
No.
Okay.
You've made your choice. It was presented as one or the other. Yeah. But I guess technically you could have done both if you really wanted to, but...
All right. Okay.
And what's
so that's
next?
that. So we are done with cannabis.
Okay, but can I, interrupt you and just ask the clarifying question that in the email I sent this afternoon, that on the ballot on the ballot it will have the tax of our measure, city measure. It will read just like this resolution basically reads right now, that it will put the tax first and the prohibition second.
That was not included. That revision was not incorporated in what was distributed to you by Sarah just a bit ago. We didn't get that change in time to incorporate it into the hard materials.
Can we instruct to do that now, so that whatever is on the ballot is the same as
We need
written
to have
in
the
the
exact
resolution?
language.
Yeah,
So-
but in the way it was in the documentation that we got, it was that the prohibition came first and then the tax came second. And I know voters, they're going to see the prohibition and they're going to
Yes.
say, I'm not voting for this because the city doesn't want this.
So I understand
But
the
they do
edit
want a
you're looking
tax.
for. I understand the edit you're looking for. It's just I didn't hear about it until I got here essentially, so.
But we
that
can
was-
make that change.
You can make that change now if we make a subsequent an amended motion. But before you do that, we'll need to get the exact language. It's not something that you can just leave up to my discretion and the city manager's discretion. So if you just give me a second, so I can flip some stuff around. Yeah. All right. I think I got it.
And I thought I found someplace in here. And actually, the second to the last page of what we got on the agenda has it refers to not operative, it doesn't have an ordinance number on it. It says not operative until
Correct.
enacted by
It would
voters.
get an ordinance number if it is approved and they're both approved, citizen and city, it's the highest number. It would
Right.
get an ordinance number at that point.
And that has the correct verbiage, in my opinion, that says an ordinance of the City of Hemet, California, establishing the City of Hemet cannabis business tax to enhance revenue streams to the city, to fund city services to the community, and prohibiting cannabis businesses in the city through December 31st, 2020.
That order is acceptable. The elections code requires very specific information to be in the question, so we can't copy that exact language. So what I'm thinking we could do is read it this way. Shall the city-sponsored measure be adopted, establishing a tax on cannabis businesses at the rate of 15% to 25% of gross revenues, or $30 per square foot of cultivation space, that will apply to illegally operating businesses, and prohibiting cannabis businesses through December 31st, 2020. And, I'm not done, I'm sorry. And if action is taken after December 31st, 2020 to permit cannabis businesses, will apply to legally established cannabis businesses estimated to generate at least $3.5 million annually in perpetuity if cannabis businesses are permitted. I'm sorry, it's a mouthful, but the elections code requires the specific tax rate to be included. It requires an estimate of the annual revenues. It requires there to be a statement as to the termination date, or if there is no termination date, a statement that there isn't. And it requires it to be phrased specifically, shall the city, or shall the measure, and then description be adopted. So there's just a lot of restrictions in the law that limit our ability to phrase it a little bit cleaner, unfortunately.
Great, you know that?
Yeah. So I've got that edited up, Sarah, and I know exactly how I did it. So if that is what you're comfortable with, you can do an amended motion.
Yeah, we need to amend, yes.
Okay, that's my amended motion.
Second that.
Okay.
All right, please vote on the amended motion. Okay.
18-070 as amended.
Mhm.
And seconded by Mike.
Yes. That amended
Okay.
motion passes.
Good job.
Okay,
Good job.
are we now done with cannabis?
Well, not really, but yeah, as far as the agenda goes.
As far as the agenda goes, okay. Up next, we have closed session. Is there anybody in the audience that wishes to address the council on anything that's on the closed session? Seeing none, we will adjourn into closed session.
Downstairs.